Why did everyone go silent when the can hissed open? No one moved. 30 soldiers stood frozen in the motor pool, boots grinding into the dust, eyes darting between the captain and the woman he just turned into a joke. The sun hit the concrete like a hammer, and the air shimmered with heat. Somewhere in the distance, a generator droned, steady and indifferent. She didn't flinch when the cold liquid hit her scalp. It splashed down her face, seeped into the collar of her uniform, and darkened the tan fabric until it clung to her skin. The fizzing sound was absurdly loud. Captain Derek Holland laughed first. He thought it was harmless fun, something to cut the tension on another suffocating Tuesday in eastern Afghanistan. "Looks like you could use a shower, sweetheart," he said. First Lieutenant Brin didn't reply. She just stood there, coke dripping from her eyelashes, her fists closing so tight that the tendons stood out like cables beneath her gloves. For a second, no one breathed. Then Holland turned away, still smirking like nothing had happened. The soldiers didn't know what to do. Some looked at their boots, others exchanged nervous glances. The hum of embarrassment filled the space. A few seconds later, work resumed, metal clanking, engines coughing to life, because that's what soldiers do when they don't know which side they're supposed to stand on. Brin's voice was calm when it finally came. "Sergeant Evans, log the inspection results. I'll finish the rest from the office." That was it. No yelling, no scene. She picked up the clipboard, made one clean note on the maintenance form, and walked away. Inside her small prefab office, the air conditioner rattled weakly against the 110-degree heat. She sat down, still soaked, the coke drying sticky against her skin. For a long moment she didn't move. She stared at the wall, at the paint peeling near the corner, at the small American flag tacked above her desk. Her heart was still racing, but not from humiliation, from restraint. Her father's voice echoed in her head, steady and low, the way he spoke when he wanted her to remember something. "Respect is earned, but dignity, you never surrender that, no matter who tries to take it." Brigadier General Victor Castillo, 3 combat tour, a name that opened doors and closed mouths, but right now she didn't feel like the daughter of anyone important. She felt like a soldier who'd been made a fool of in front of her own team. She pressed her palms flat against the desk and inhaled through her nose until her heartbeat slowed. There was something she hadn't told anyone, something Holland couldn't possibly know. In 72 hours, her father was arriving at Fob Ghazni for an operational assessment. And when he did, every officer's record, every report, every incident in the last month would cross his desk. Brin Castillo had been in uniform for 4 years. Texas A&M graduate, commissioned through ROTC, logistics officer for the 10th Mountain Division. She wasn't a frontline trigger puller, but she was the reason convoys rolled on time, why rifles and food and fuel reached the outposts when they were supposed to. She knew every serial number, every truck schedule, every weak link in the chain. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept people alive. Her soldiers respected that about her. She didn't bark orders. She didn't need to. They followed her because she was steady. In a place where tempers snapped like dry twigs, steadiness was power. She remembered her father teaching her to shoot on a range outside San Antonio, iron sights, patient breathing. "Discipline isn't control," he'd said. "It's knowing when to act and when to wait." That lesson kept her hand off the radio now. It would have been easy to call Holland out publicly, to let her anger explode across the net. But anger is noisy. Discipline is quiet. She unzipped her notebook and started writing. The report was factual. Time 7:05. Location, Motorpool Fob Ghazni. Subject, unprofessional conduct. She wrote what happened, listed witnesses, and kept her language clinical. No emotion, no accusation, just truth. It was the kind of document that made people uncomfortable because it left no space for excuses. When she signed her name at the bottom, her hands were steady again. The next morning, She walked into Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's office. He was a big man with a soft voice and eyes that had seen too much. She placed the report on his desk and stood at attention until he looked up. He read silently, flipping pages, jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You handled this right, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "I'll take it from here." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." What Hayes didn't tell her was that this was Holland's first time. There were whispers, other junior officers, subtle complaints, none of them formal enough to stick. It was the kind of behavior the system sometimes brushed aside under the old excuse, thicker skin. It's a combat zone. But this time, it was written down. This time, it had a witness list. And this time, it was going to reach the one-star general in charge of evaluating every commander on base. Outside, the heat had turned brutal. Soldiers moved between rows of MRAPs, tools clanging, dust swirling. Brin stepped back into her rhythm, convoy manifests, supply runs, fuel tallies. She didn't mention the incident again. She didn't have to. Her platoon noticed, though, the way she carried herself, calm, unshaken, the kind of calm that unnerves bullies. That night she sat alone in the dim light of her quarters, writing in her journal. The sound of helicopters pulsed overhead. "People think respect is loud," she wrote, "but sometimes it's just the silence after you refuse to break." 2 days later, the base went on alert for a VIP visit. The rumor mill exploded. Some general from the Pentagon doing a surprise inspection of logistics and resupply. Everyone scrambled to make their numbers look perfect. Holland was in the TOC, bragging that his company would ace the assessment. He still didn't know. When the Black Hawk touched down and the dust cleared, Brin watched from the motor pool. She recognized the silhouette before anyone else, the squared shoulders, the slow, deliberate stride. Brigadier General Victor Castillo had arrived. The first day was routine. Meetings, reports, protocol briefings. Word spread fast that the general was sharp, detail-oriented, and unimpressed by excuses. On the second day, he requested a tour of the logistics operations, the motor pool specifically. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes personally escorted him. Brin was summoned to brief the general on maintenance readiness. She entered the briefing room, spine straight, uniform crisp. Her father stood at the front, arms folded, expression unreadable. Around them sat the senior officers of FOB Ghazni, Holland among them, lounging at the far end of the table. Brin saluted. "First Lieutenant Castillo, sir. Logistics operations." "Proceed," the general said. Her voice was steady as she outlined convoy schedules, maintenance intervals, and fuel logistics. Every answer was precise, every chart in order, no mention of the incident. When it was over, General Castillo nodded once. "Thank you, Lieutenant," dismissed. She saluted again and left the room, her boots echoing down the hallway. Holland snorted quietly after the door closed. "She takes this stuff way too seriously," he whispered to the officer beside him. But the general heard it. He didn't react, not yet. 20 minutes later, he called Hayes into his office. "Tell me about the incident report," he said. Hayes hesitated. "Sir." "The one involving Captain Holland," the general clarified, eyes fixed on the folder in front of him. "I read it last night. I want to know why no formal action has been taken." Hayes explained Driscoll's reluctance, the informal counseling, the politics. The general listened without a word, then picked up the phone and dialed the base commander. His tone was calm but final. "I'm ordering a command-directed investigation into the conduct of Captain Derek Holland. Effective immediately, he's relieved of duty pending findings." When he hung up, he simply said, "Thank you, Colonel, that will be all." That afternoon, Holland was summoned to the command office. He swaggered in, confident, still clueless. The general waited until the door closed behind him. "Captain Holland," he said evenly, "explain what happened in the motor pool 3 days ago." Holland shrugged. "Just a joke, sir. She overreacted. I apologized." The general leaned forward. "First Lieutenant Brin Castillo is my daughter." The words hit harder than any reprimand. The room fell dead silent. He continued, voice calm but razor-sharp. "This isn't personal, Captain, it's professional. You humiliated an officer in front of her soldiers, undermined discipline, and demonstrated conduct unbecoming your rank. The investigation will proceed." Dismissed. Holland didn't move for a second. Then he saluted, shaky and pale, and left the room. Outside, the desert wind howled through the open corridors. Inside, the silence stayed heavy. That night, Brin sat in her quarters, unaware of the conversation that had taken place. She was reviewing convoy manifests when someone knocked. It was Hayes. "Investigation been opened," he said quietly. "Effective now. You did good, Lieutenant." She didn't ask who had pushed it through. She just nodded. When he left, she looked down at her hands, the same hands that had clenched tight when the coke poured down her head. This time, they were still. Sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through the chain of command and lets justice do the talking. She smiled faintly, then closed her laptop. Outside, the night hummed with distant rotor blades and the sound of soldiers going about their endless routines. Tomorrow would be another day, convoys, reports, responsibilities, but something in the air had changed. Respect, once lost, had found its way back. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It just stands its ground, quiet, steady, and unbroken. How do you hold your head high when everyone's watching to see if you'll break? The morning after the investigation was announced, the base felt quieter, not in sound but in mood. Conversations stopped when Brin walked by. Soldiers she didn't know saluted her with a little more precision. Others looked away, guilty or curious. It was hard to tell which. She kept her routine. PT at dawn, quick shower, chow hall coffee, then straight to the motor pool. Her convoy briefings didn't change. Her tone didn't change. The only thing that did was the silence that followed her, like the whole base was holding its breath. Word travels fast in a combat zone. By sunrise, everyone knew that Captain Holland had been pulled from duty. Some thought it was coincidence. Others knew better. And those who had witnessed what happened that day in the motor pool finally let themselves say it out loud. He had it coming. Still, Brin felt no victory, just wait. Because she knew what justice cost in this place. It wasn't clean. It never was. She was reviewing the new convoy manifest when Sergeant Evans approached, hesitant. "Ma'am," he said softly, "some of the guys, they just wanted you to know we got your back." She looked up from her clipboard, studying his face. Evans wasn't the kind to flatter anyone. He was blunt, solid, one of those NCOs who measured people by how they worked, not by what they wore. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," she said. He nodded once. "What that captain did wasn't right. You handled it the way an officer should." Brin gave a small smile. "That's the goal." He hesitated before walking off, then turned back. "Ma'am, if it was me, I don't think I could have stayed that calm." When he left, Brin stood alone between two rows of MRAPs, the metal glinting under the Afghan sun. The smell of diesel, sweat, and hot sand filled the air. She let herself exhale. The calm he admired wasn't peace. It was control, hard, exhausting control. Because part of her still wanted to scream. That night she sat on her cot, writing in her notebook again. What's the line between strength and silence? Between restraint and fear? She thought about that question ever since the incident. Her father had always said that discipline meant knowing when to act, but he'd never said how to live with the waiting. She stared at the page, then closed the book. Outside, the base lights glowed through the dust, a pale halo over the wire. Somewhere out there, young soldiers were pulling guard duty, scanning the dark horizon for threats that didn't announce themselves. Not all battles were fought out there. Some were fought in hallways, reports in silence. 2 days later, she was called to a briefing at the TOC. General Castillo would be there, along with the senior staff. It was supposed to be a standard logistics review, but nothing about the air in that room felt standard. She entered quietly, saluted, and took her seat. Holland's chair at the end of the table was empty. The general began the meeting like any other, calm, precise, methodical, but when he reached the section on leadership accountability, his tone changed. "There's something I need every officer on this base to understand," he said, scanning the room. "Respect is not a courtesy, it's an operational requirement. Without it, discipline fails, and when discipline fails, people die." His gaze lingered for a moment on the empty chair. Then he continued, voice steady. "Rank doesn't make you untouchable, it makes you responsible. Some of you need to remember that." No one said a word. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. Brin sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on her notes. But inside she felt the slow burn of validation, not the satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet relief of being seen. Her father never once looked at her directly during the speech, but he didn't need to. She understood. After the briefing, she stepped outside into the blinding sun. She took off her patrol cap, wiped her brow, and just stood there for a moment, letting the heat press down on her until her heartbeat steadied. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes joined her a minute later. "Hell of a statement," he said. Brin nodded. He was right. "He usually is," Hayes said with a small smile. Then he added quietly, "You did good, Lieutenant. You didn't let it make you bitter." She looked at him. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When something like that happens, something that humiliates you, how do you stop it from changing you?" He thought for a moment before answering. "You don't. It changes you. But that's not always bad. It's what you do with it that matters." Then he looked out toward the motor pool, where her soldiers were working under the sun. "They'll remember how you handled this, probably more than they'll remember anything else from this deployment." That night Brin couldn't sleep. The air was thick and the generator outside her quarters hummed endlessly. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this point: ROTC, Fort Benning, the lessons, the long nights, the pressure to be perfect in a system that didn't forgive mistakes. She thought about her father, not as a general, but as the man who'd told her at 12 years old that a Castillo never bows to arrogance. She closed her eyes. Some lessons, it seemed, were written into the blood. 3 days later, the investigation concluded. The findings were swift and clear. Multiple witness statements corroborating unprofessional conduct, prior informal complaints, and a pattern of disrespect toward subordinates. Captain Derek Holland received a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand, permanent, career-ending. He was reassigned to a rear logistics unit in Bagram. The report circulated quietly. No grand announcements, just paperwork, but everyone knew. When Brin walked through the chow hall that evening, conversation stopped again, this time out of respect. Not fear, respect. She nodded to a few familiar faces, got her tray, and sat alone by the window. Through the glass, she could see the motor pool, bathed in the orange light of sunset. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small breath of peace. Later that night, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, General Castillo stood there, still in uniform, his face calm but softer than usual. "Sir," she said automatically, straightening. "At ease," he said. For a moment neither spoke. Then he nodded toward the desk inside. "Mind if I come in?" She stepped aside. He looked around the cramped cot, the stacked notebooks, the map of convoy routes pinned to the wall. It was the kind of space that told him everything he needed to know about how his daughter lived out here. "I read your report," he said finally, "and I read every word of the investigation." Brin stood silent. "I want you to know, I didn't intervene because you're my daughter." "I know, sir. I intervened because you were right." He met her eyes steady. You did everything the way an officer should. Calm, professional, by the book. I'm proud of you." For a moment the formality dropped. She saw her father, not the general, just the man who used to kneel beside her at the range, correcting her grip on the rifle. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly. He gave a small nod, then turned to leave. But at the door he paused. "There's one more thing," he said. "Leadership isn't about how you handle power. It's about how you handle humiliation." Then he left. She stood there for a long time after the door closed. The days that followed were different, lighter somehow. Her soldiers worked with renewed energy. Morale improved. Convoys rolled smoother, fewer delays, fewer mistakes. Respect had returned, not just for her, but within the unit itself. Even the way they talked to each other changed. Less shouting, more listening, as if everyone had learned something invisible but lasting. A week later, Brin stood at the flight line, watching her father's helicopter lift off. The rotor wash whipped at her uniform, the dust rising in clouds. She raised her hand in salute as the Black Hawk rose into the blue. He didn't look back, he didn't need to. When the helicopter disappeared into the haze, she lowered her hand and smiled faintly. He had taught her one last lesson, and maybe, she thought, this was how dignity sounded. Not loud, not bitter, just steady. That night, she wrote one final note in her journal before lights out. "Some people think strength means winning battles, but sometimes it's standing in front of 30 people, drenched in humiliation, and refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing you fall. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it just acts." She closed the notebook and lay back on her cot, listening to the night outside, the low hum of diesel, the murmur of voices, the sound of a war that never really slept. For the first time since that morning in the motor pool, she drifted off easily. Because deep down, she knew something simple but unshakable. She had done the right thing. And in the army, in life, that's rarer than most people realize. What happens after justice, when the war doesn't stop for it? 2 weeks passed since the investigation closed. The memory of that Coke can had faded into whispers, then into silence. The base moved on because that's what soldiers do. There's always another mission, another convoy, another dawn that starts with the sound of rotors cutting through the heat. But for Brin Castillo, something subtle had shifted. The respect in her soldiers' eyes, the quiet nods in the hallway, even the way junior officers greeted her now, not out of fear, but something closer to trust. Yet with that trust came expectation. An expectation in war was wait. It was just before sunrise when the call came. Convoy Alpha 7, Outpost Derek, routine resupply, ammo, water, rations, medkits. Nothing special until the intelligence report dropped an hour before rollout. Possible insurgent activity along Route Hammer. She stood over the operations map, tracing the red line that snaked across the valley. The road was narrow, flanked by steep ridges, perfect for ambushes. "Risk level?" she asked. Her intel sergeant hesitated. "Moderate to high, ma'am. Drone picked up some movement near checkpoint 7, but could be locals." Brin exhaled slowly. Could be. She hated that phrase, it meant no one really knew. Hayes approved the mission anyway. Supplies had to move. Men at Darak were running low, and the weather window for airlift was closing. Brin didn't argue. Logistics didn't wait for comfort. By 900 hours, the convoy was lined up, 12 vehicles, 3 MRAPs up front, cargo trucks in the middle, gun trucks in the rear. Engines idled low, heat waves rising from the hoods. Brin stood beside her vehicle, helmet strapped, gloves on. She wasn't required to ride this mission. She could have delegated, but that wasn't her way. If her soldiers rolled, she rolled. Sergeant Evans checked the comms, looked up at her. "You sure you want a ride, ma'am?" She gave him a look. "Evans, if I ever start leading from a desk, shoot me." He cracked a grin. "Copy that, ma'am." They rolled out just after 9:30. The base gates clanked open, and the desert stretched ahead, wide, bright, and merciless. Inside the MRAP, the air was thick with dust and diesel. The radio crackled with check-ins. Brin sat behind the driver, headset on, scanning the route through the ballistic glass. The landscape looked quiet, but quiet in Afghanistan never meant safe. They hit the halfway point without incident. The rhythm of the road lulled everyone into that uneasy calm that comes before something breaks. Brin glanced at her map again. Next checkpoint 7, the one Intel flagged. She keyed her mic. All elements eyes up, maintain spacing, watch your sectors. Evans's voice came through. Roger that. Then, as they rounded a curve between two ridgelines, it happened. A flash, a roar. The ground jumped. The lead MRAP vanished in a burst of smoke and sand. Contact front, IED, IED. Brin's world narrowed to sound, shouting, gunfire, radio chatter, the sharp ping of rounds against armor. Driver push left, get us behind cover. Copy. The MRAP lurched off the road, suspension screaming. Brin grabbed the dash to steady herself. Her training kicked in. Calm, focus, breathe. Alpha 7 actual to all units, form defensive perimeter. Return fire, suppress ridgeline. Rounds tore through the air. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder. She could see muzzle flashes, 2, maybe 3 shooters on the ridge. Controlled bursts, trained aim, not amateurs. Gunner 3 o'clock high. The .50 cal roared back, sending tracers arcing into the hillside. Evans's voice crackled over comms. Lead trucks hit bad, 2 down, maybe more, we're pinned. Brin gritted her teeth. Stay low, returning fire. She popped the hatch and climbed halfway out. The sun burned against her visor. She raised her rifle, scanning the ridge. One target, dark movement, she exhaled, squeezed, fired. The silhouette dropped. Another muzzle flash, she ducked, feeling the round glance off the turret armor inches from her head. Ma'am, get down, Evans yelled. She ignored him. Keep suppressing, we need air support now. Already on the horn, ma'am. 30 seconds later, she heard it, the distant whine of engines cutting through the air. 2 Apache gunships sweeping in low over the valley. Relief surged through her chest like breath after drowning. The Apache opened up a chain gun, stitching the ridge, sending dust and debris skyward. Within seconds, the gunfire from above ceased. Cease fire, cease fire. Silence fell, just the ticking of hot engines and the ragged sound of breathing through radios. Brin climbed out fully, boots hitting the ground. The blast crater where the lead MRAP had been was a black wound in the dirt. Evans joined her, face streaked with dust. They didn't make it, he said quietly. She nodded, jaw tightening. Get a casualty report, I'll call it in. Hours later, the convoy limped back to base. The vehicles were scorched, armor pitted, windows cracked. Brin walked straight to her office, still in full gear, dust caked into every seam of her uniform. She keyed the radio, reported casualties, 2 KIA, 3 wounded. Then she sat down, removed her helmet, and just stared at the wall again. The same wall where, 2 weeks earlier, she'd sat soaked in coke, trying to calm her breath. Different kind of silence this time, heavier. She thought about the faces of the 2 soldiers they'd lost. She just briefed them that morning, routine check-ins, small jokes about chow, nothing special. Now they were gone. She pressed her hands together, fingertips white. Her father's words came back again. Leadership isn't about how you handle power. It's about how you handle humiliation. But he'd left something out. Leadership was also about how you carry guilt, the kind that no one talks about in after-action reports. Later that night, she met with Hayes in the tactical room. The lights were dim, maps lit by the glow of monitors. He looked up from the casualty roster. You brought them home, Lieutenant. That's what matters. Brin shook her head. 2 didn't make it home. Hayes sighed. You did everything right. Right route, right spacing, calms discipline, immediate suppression. You couldn't have known. She stared at the table. Still feels like I should have. He leaned forward. You ever notice the people who care the most about their soldiers are the ones who blame themselves for everything that happens to them? She looked up at him. He held her gaze. You're one of those, Brin, and that's why they follow you. That night she couldn't sleep again. The faces of the two men replayed behind her eyes. One of them, Specialist Moore, was only 22. He joined 6 months before the deployment. His last words before they rolled out were, "Ma'am, do we get real coffee when we get back?" She'd smiled then. Now the question cut deep. She got up, walked outside. The desert air was cold at night, stars sharp as broken glass. The camp was quiet, save for the hum of the perimeter lights. She stood near the motor pool, the same place everything had started. Different kind of silence now, not humiliation, not anger, just reflection. Sometimes, she thought, war strips everything down until all that's left is who you are when no one's watching. The next morning she gathered her platoon. Dust hung in the air, pale and golden. She looked at their faces, tired, hollow-eyed, but waiting. "Yesterday wasn't easy," she began. "We did everything right and we still took hits. That's how this job works sometimes. You plan, you train, you execute, and still you lose people." She paused, scanning the line of soldiers. But those two, Moore and Jenkins, they trusted this team. They trusted us to bring their fight home. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep rolling, keep working, and we're going to do it right. Because that's how we honor them. No one moved, no one spoke. Then Evan stepped forward, snapped to attention, and saluted. One by one the rest followed. Brin returned the salute, the lump in her throat sharp and sudden. Later that week, her father called in via secure line. His face flickered on the monitor, clear but distant. "I heard about the ambush," he said. "Yes, sir. You handled it well." She hesitated. "We lost 2. "I read the report," he said softly. "You saved 10. He paused. "You know, I used to think command was about strategy, about decisions. But the older I get, the more I realize it's about people. And people don't remember how perfect you were. They remember if you cared." She swallowed hard. "I try to, sir." "I know," he said. Then almost gently, "And that's why I sleep better knowing you're out there." The screen went dark. That night Brin wrote again. "Leadership doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when your people stop believing you care." She put down her pen and looked out at the lights over the base, small, fragile stars against the desert. She knew the war wouldn't end because of her. The army wouldn't change overnight. People like Holland would still exist. But maybe, somewhere in the silence of her small victories, the idea of what leadership should look like had shifted, even just a little. And maybe that was enough. Sometimes the strongest thing a leader can do is care when no one else does. What do you do when the right thing isn't the ordered thing? 3 weeks after the ambush, the desert quieted again. No explosions, no radio calls in the night, no medevacs slicing the sky. Just heat, dust, and the steady rhythm of duty, the illusion of calm that never lasted long. For Brin Castillo, it was a fragile peace. Convoys rolled smoother, morale climbed, and for the first time in months, her soldiers were sleeping full nights. But in Afghanistan, peace was never a gift. It was a setup. The calm before someone made a decision that tested everything. And that decision came, not from her father this time, not from above the clouds of brass and politics, but from her own command. The order came down on a Wednesday morning. Hayes called her into his office. His face was tight, not angry, just troubled. "Brin, I've got something for you," he said. "We've been directed to coordinate an emergency supply drop to an Afghan local defense unit near Lashkar Ridge. Remote area, rough terrain, no air corridor approved, so it'll be ground transport only." She frowned. Lashkar Ridge, sir, that route's unstable. Last week's drone footage showed possible insurgent staging along the pass. I know, he said quietly. Command's aware. But the regional liaison insists the local unit's friendly. They're holding ground against Taliban elements. Brin didn't answer. She'd been in-country long enough to know what local defense unit sometimes meant half-trained militias with shifting loyalties. They'd help you on Monday and sell you out by Thursday. Why us? She asked. Because we're the only ones with trucks ready to roll, Hayes replied. You're the best logistician on base. You can pull it off. She nodded slowly. Permission to speak freely, sir. He sighed. Always. This feels wrong, she said. Intel's thin. The route's compromised. If we send a convoy out there without air cover, we're rolling blind. Hayes looked down at his desk. I agree, but the directive came from regional command. I can't countermand it. Her throat tightened, so we just follow it anyway. That's the job, Lieutenant, he said softly. Orders stand. You leave tomorrow at 600. That night she stared at the map spread across her desk. Route Bearclaw, narrow mountain roads, low visibility, multiple choke points, a logistics nightmare and a sniper's dream. Her instinct screamed no, but instinct didn't outrank orders. Still, something didn't sit right. She called up the satellite imagery from the Intel archives. The area around Lashkar Ridge looked quiet, too quiet. No civilian traffic, no heat signatures near the supposed friendly outpost. It didn't add up. She ran a background check on the Afghan unit's command designation. The name listed was Commander Darim Rahim. She recognized it from an old report months back. That same name had been flagged for possible dual allegiance. Her pulse quickened. She picked up the phone and called the Intel office. This is First Lieutenant Castillo. I need the last 3 SIGINT summaries from Lashkar Ridge, date range the past 2 weeks. The analyst hesitated. Ma'am, those are classified under regional command. Then flag it as an operational safety request, she said, voice firm. I'm not sending soldiers into a trap because someone up top wants to play politics. 10 minutes later, the files hit her inbox. She opened them and froze. Intercepted comms, mentions of targeting coalition resupply, coordinates matching the Lashkar route. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't a hunch anymore, it was a setup. She walked straight to Hayes's office, report in hand. Sir, I've got evidence this convoy's walking into an ambush, she said. We can't go through with it. Hayes skimmed the file, jaw tightening. Where'd you get this? Intel archives, she said. The comms are dated 2 days ago. Lashkar Ridge is compromised. He sighed. Brin, I believe you, but this came from regional command. I can't scrub a mission on my own authority, not without direct confirmation. Then escalate it, she said. Show them this. I did, he said quietly. They said proceed as planned. They're calling the intel inconclusive. Inconclusive, she repeated, incredulous. Sir, this could get people killed. I know. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Hayes said, I can't stop it, but I also can't tell you what to do once you're out there. Make of that what you will. Their eyes met, the unspoken message clear. At 600 the next morning, the convoy was staged. Engines rumbled, sunlight glinting off armor plates. Brin climbed into her vehicle, headset on, eyes sharp. The pit in her stomach was heavy as lead. Evans looked at her. You good, ma'am? Define good, she said. He smirked faintly. Copy that. As they rolled out, the base gates closed behind them. The desert stretched ahead, vast and unforgiving. Every mile felt longer than the one before. At checkpoint 4, she keyed her mic. Alpha convoy hold, we're adjusting route. Say again, Evans asked. We're diverting west, she replied. Route Bearclaw is compromised. That's not the approved path, ma'am, he reminded her. I'm aware, she said. Command not gonna like it. She looked out over the ridge, where the official route twisted between canyons that could hide 100 rifles. Command can court-martial me later, she said. For now, we stay alive. They turned off the main road, kicking up a storm of dust. The alternate path was rough, half washed out, barely navigable. But it was open terrain, no choke points, no blind turns. Half an hour later, Evans's voice crackled through. Ma'am, you need to see this. She looked out the side window. Smoke rising from the direction of Lashkar Ridge. She grabbed her binoculars. Through the haze she saw it burning vehicles, not theirs, a separate column of trucks, same markings. A second convoy had gone out. Her blood ran cold. Jesus Christ, she whispered, they sent another team. She could hear the chaos on the radio, distress calls, static, overlapping voices. The ambush she'd predicted was real, unfolding right now. She clenched her jaw. All units maintain course. Do not engage. We're not equipped for rescue. We'd only add to the casualties. Evans's voice cracked slightly. Ma'am, we can't just leave them. I know, she said softly, but if we go in, we die too. She hated herself for saying it, but it was the truth. When they returned to base 6 hours later, the mood was grim. Reports confirmed. 3 vehicles destroyed, 5 soldiers dead. The other convoy had rolled early on direct orders from regional command. Brin went straight to Hayes's office. She slammed the report down. They knew, she said, voice trembling. They had this intel and still sent them. Hayes rubbed his face, exhausted. I know. So what happens now? He looked up. Nothing. It'll be written off as bad intel and enemy luck. You know how this works. She stared at him, disbelief turning into quiet fury. We're supposed to be better than this. Hayes met her eyes. We're supposed to be doesn't mean we always are. That night, she walked back to her quarters under a blood-orange sky. The air was still, heavy with the scent of burned diesel drifting from the direction of the mountains. She sat on her cot and didn't move for a long time. Her uniform still smelled like sand and smoke. When she finally opened her journal, her handwriting trembled. Obedience keeps the machine running. Conscience keeps you human. Sometimes the hardest part of command is realizing you can't serve both perfectly. She stared at the words until the ink blurred. The next morning her father called. He already knew. Report says you altered your route, he said flatly. Yes, sir. Why? Because the approved one was a death trap, she said. Intel confirmed it. He was silent for a long time. Then, you saved your people. She nodded, but 5 others died. That wasn't your fault. Wasn't it? No, he said quietly. It was the system. You can't carry every failure that isn't yours. She exhaled shakily. Sometimes I wonder if I'm in the wrong profession, Dad. He smiled faintly. If you're asking that question, you're probably exactly where you're needed. Later that day, Hayes approached her in the motor pool. I heard about the call, he said. She nodded. I also heard command reviewed your deviation. Official verdict, justified action under field discretion. She blinked, meaning. Meaning they're not coming after you. Brin let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Hayes grinned slightly. You made the right call, Lieutenant, and not because you were right, but because you cared enough to risk being wrong. That night, she watched the sunset from the edge of the base, the horizon glowing like fire over the sand. For the first time in weeks, she felt both proud and deeply tired. Because she'd learned something no training manual ever taught. That leadership wasn't about perfect obedience or spotless records or even victory. It was about conscience and the courage to live with its cost. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't pulling the trigger. It's saying no when silence would be easier. What happens after you do the right thing, and the world decides it didn't want you to. 2 weeks after the Lashkar Ridge mission, Brin noticed the small things first. Emails left off distro lists. Meetings that accidentally started without her. Paperwork rooted around her desk. No one said it out loud, but she felt it, the slow turning of the machine against her. She had disobeyed the route. Saved lives, yes. But she had embarrassed someone higher up, who needed the report to say successful operation, 0 deviations. And in the army, saving people didn't always save your career. Hayes saw it happening too. He called her in one morning, shut the door and dropped the formal tone. "They're freezing you out, Brin." "I noticed," she said dryly. "You'll get through it," he said. "Just keep your head down." She smiled without humor. You ever notice how keeping your head down usually means letting other people look away? He leaned back tired. You can't win every fight. Then why wear the uniform at all? He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know anymore. That night she went running long after curfew, loops around the perimeter wall, her boots pounding the gravel. Each stride burned away a little of the frustration, but not the ache underneath it, the one that whispered that maybe she didn't belong here. She joined to serve something bigger than herself, but lately the bigger thing looked a lot like politics in camouflage. Still, she couldn't stop caring. She thought about the faces of her platoon. Evans, who trusted her instincts more than any regulation. Specialist Vega, who still called her ma'am with half a grin even after 12-hour shifts. They believed in her because she believed in them. That had to count for something. A week later, a supply glitch hit the base. 3 pallets of medical stock mislabeled, one missing entirely. It should have been a simple correction, but somehow her name was attached to the manifest. When the report reached headquarters, it read, "Castillo Logistics Section, error in medical shipment." She stared at the document, jaw tight. Her logs were flawless. She double-checked every line. Someone had changed it after she signed. Evans saw the look in her eyes and said quietly, "You think this is payback?" "I think coincidences don't stack up this neatly," she replied. She could have filed a complaint, but she didn't. She just fixed it. Because paperwork could be rewritten, but truth, the kind her soldiers saw every day, couldn't. Days turned into weeks. Each morning she'd wake before dawn, stand outside with her coffee, and watch the sun crawl over the wire. She'd listen to the distant call to prayer drifting from the village, and wonder how long she could keep fighting battles that didn't involve bullets. One morning, Hayes joined her. "Still thinking about leaving?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "That obvious?" He chuckled softly. "You've got that look people get right before they decide whether to re-enlist or breathe again." She sipped her coffee. "I used to think service was about sacrifice. Now I think it's about patience. Endless, grinding patience." He nodded. "Patience keeps armies alive, but sometimes it kills the soul." They stood in silence, watching the light spill over the desert. Later that afternoon, she got an unexpected radio call from the airfield. A medevac flight was returning with casualties from an IED blast west of the valley. They needed logistics support to clear a landing zone and offload equipment fast. She was already moving before they finished the sentence. At the pad, the helicopter's rotors chopped through the hot air. Dust whipped her face as the bird touched down. Medics ran forward, stretchers in hand. She grabbed a crate of IV fluids, hauling it from the cargo bay. A medic shouted, "Careful, ma'am, that's 60 pounds." She didn't slow. "So am I." Evans caught up to her, grinning despite the chaos. "You sure you're logistics, ma'am? You move like infantry." She smiled faintly. "Just doing my job." But inside she felt something click, quiet grounding. This, she thought, this was why she was here. Not the reports, not the politics, the moments that mattered. When the medevac lifted off again, leaving silence and the smell of fuel behind. One of the young medics looked at her. "Thanks, ma'am. Not many officers show up down here." She shrugged. "The job doesn't end at the desk." He nodded. "Wish there were more like you." She didn't answer. She just watched the helicopter fade into the heat haze, the rotor wash scattering sand like ghosts. That evening, she found a message waiting in her inbox. From her father. Subject line, "Proud doesn't begin to cover it." No body text, just that one sentence. She stared at it for a long time, then closed her laptop slowly. Sometimes silence said everything. A few days later, word spread that General Castillo had been reassigned to a new command back in D.C. Brin heard it through a friend in operations. When the news reached her platoon, Evans muttered, "Guess that means the brass shield just left the building." She smiled faintly. "I never had a shield, just a standard to live up to." Still, she felt the absence immediately. No safety net. No one with stars to quietly fix what politics broke. She was on her own now. The pushback came quietly. Her next promotion packet, delayed for administrative review. Her leave request, denied without explanation. Someone wanted her tired, maybe even reckless. But she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She poured herself into her soldiers instead. Training, maintenance, schedules, endless problem-solving. When the motor pool lights burned late into the night, everyone knew who was inside, Castillo, still working. It became its own kind of rebellion, excellence as defiance. One night, as she walked back to her quarters, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Ma'am," Evans called, jogging up. "Word is, you're on the list for rotation stateside in 3 months." She blinked. "I am." "Unofficially, somebody upstairs wants to move you out quietly. New project at Fort Bragg." She studied him. "How'd you hear that?" "Motorpool's got ears everywhere," he said, half smiling. She laughed softly. "So they're promoting me out of the way." "Maybe, or maybe the army figured you've done enough for one tour." She looked out at the dark horizon. "I'm not sure what enough even means anymore." The next morning, she gathered her platoon for one last field inspection. The air smelled like rain, a rare thing out here. Rows of vehicles stood ready, clean, engines humming. She walked the line slowly, running her hand across the armor, checking the details like she always did. Evans watched her, then said quietly, "You changed this place, you know." She glanced at him. "I just did my job." "No," he said, "you reminded people how to do it right." For a moment she had no words. That night she wrote her final journal entry of the deployment. "They say discipline keeps order, maybe, but compassion keeps order human. I used to think the army would break me. It didn't. It just showed me the cost of staying whole." She closed the notebook, feeling the weight of the months settle inside her, not like a burden but like proof. Proof that she had faced humiliation without rage, danger without fear, and betrayal without surrendering her belief in right and wrong. The next day, as her transport lifted off from Fob Ghazni, she looked down through the window at the base shrinking below. Dust trails, tents, the motor pool glinting in the sun. She thought about the Coke can, the laughter, the silence afterward. About the ambush, the orders, the moral lines she'd refused to cross. It all looked smaller now, but the lesson never would be. Because in every command, in every system, there are 2 wars. The one outside the wire and the one inside the soul. She survived both. Back in Texas months later, she stood on her father's porch at sunrise, coffee in hand. The air smelled of cedar and wet earth. He joined her quietly, no uniform now, just a worn sweatshirt and tired eyes. "You did good," he said simply. She nodded. "Sometimes I wonder if it mattered." "It did," he said. "Maybe not to everyone, but to the ones watching, the ones learning how to lead, it mattered more than you'll ever know." They stood there in silence, the kind that only people who have both seen war can share. Finally she said, "Dad, I think I'm done chasing rank." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time to start chasing purpose." She looked out at the horizon, golden and endless, and felt something she hadn't in years: peace. Not the peace of victory, the peace of understanding. That dignity isn't about standing tall in front of others. It's about standing true when no one's clapping. Sometime, the quietest soldier carries the loudest legacy. How do you come home when the war never quite lets you? The first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy, hollow kind that made every sound too loud. No rotors, no radio chatter, no shouted orders bouncing off concrete walls. Just wind through mesquite trees and the faint creak of her father's porch swing. For weeks after she came home, Brin Castillo tried to sleep without the hum of generators. But her body still woke at 500, heart racing, waiting for a briefing that no longer existed. She'd taken a job with a disaster relief contractor in Austin, supply chain logistics, coordination, field deployment. On paper it was perfect, same skills, no bullets. In reality, it was different. Meetings instead of missions, budgets instead of battle reports. The people were kind, polite, even deferential when they learned she'd served overseas. But no one really knew. They thanked her for her service and then complained about slow Wi-Fi. She smiled through it, but inside something restless stirred. One morning, her boss called her into a conference room. "Castillo, we've got a situation down south, flooding near Corpus. Local distribution's a mess. You're the only one who's managed large-scale convoys. Think you can head a field team?" She nodded instantly. Orders, mission, objective. It almost felt familiar. By dusk, she was on the road in a government van filled with water pumps, food kits, and volunteers. When they arrived, the town looked drowned. Streets turned to rivers, rooftops barely above the waterline. Civilians waded through waist-deep murk, carrying what little they owned. Brin stepped out into the rain, boots sinking in mud, clipboard in hand. For a heartbeat, she smelled diesel and sand and had to remind herself, this isn't Afghanistan. Still, crisis felt the same everywhere. Chaos, confusion, the need for someone to take charge. She started moving, assigning drivers, marking routes, organizing offload points. Her voice carried steady through the downpour. No rank, no salute, just calm authority. And people listened. A young volunteer jogged up, breathless. "Ma'am, we've got a problem. Bridge on County 12 is out. Supplies can't reach the shelter." She checked the map. "What's the alternate?" "There isn't one, not unless we cut through the low road." "That's under 3 feet of water." "Yes, ma'am." She looked out across the valley, brown water churning through debris, cars half submerged. The easy answer was wait for daylight. The right answer was move now before the shelter runs dry. Old instincts stirred again. She keyed her radio. "Team Bravo, prep the high-axle trucks. We're going through the low road, slow and tight formation. Keep headlights on the rear vehicle. No heroics." Someone muttered, "Ma'am, that's risky." She smiled faintly. "So is hunger." For 2 hours, they crawled through water and mud, headlights cutting tunnels of white through the rain. When they finally reached the shelter, the volunteers erupted in cheers. Kids lined up for food packs. Old men clasped her hand and whispered blessings in Spanish. Brin just nodded, wet hair plastered to her face. Same feeling as after a convoy, exhaustion edged with relief. Different battlefield, same victory. That night, sitting under a broken awning, she shared coffee from a paper cup with an older volunteer named Lee. "You military?" Lee asked. "Used to be." "Thought so, the way you move, like you're still in command." Brin chuckled, "Habit dies slow." Lee studied her, "You miss it." She thought for a long time before answering. Parts of it, the purpose, the clarity, out there right and wrong weren't easy, but at least they mattered. Lee nodded. You know, out here they still do, just quieter. That stayed with her. When she returned to Austin, her supervisor called her in again. Whatever you did down there worked. We're setting up a permanent rapid response unit. I want you running it. She blinked at me. You've got the background, the calm, the instincts. Frankly, you scare the interns, but in a good way. She laughed. I'll take that as a compliment. It is. Welcome aboard, Director Castillo. Director, not captain. Different title, same mission. Take chaos, make order, protect lives. The weeks that followed were busy, training civilians in convoy coordination, building spreadsheets that looked suspiciously like operation briefs. But at night, when the office went quiet, she'd catch herself glancing at the framed photo on her desk, her platoon in Afghanistan, grinning under a blazing sun. She wondered where they were now, if they still carried the same invisible weight she did. Sometimes she'd dream of the motor pool, the hiss of the Coke can, the laughter, the silence after. And she'd wake up not angry anymore, just grateful. Because without that moment, she might never have learned what real dignity looked like. One afternoon, a young logistics analyst knocked on her office door. Ma'am, sorry, Director. I was wondering if you could look over my plan for the next deployment. I'm worried I missed something. Brin motioned him in. He looked barely 23, nervous, too eager to prove himself. As he spoke, she recognized pieces of her younger self, precision hiding anxiety. When he finished, she said, It's solid, but next time before you brief, ask yourself one thing. If this goes wrong, will my people still trust me? He frowned. Why that question? Because that's the one that keeps you honest, she said softly. The rest is just math. He nodded, scribbling the note. When he left, she smiled faintly. Maybe this was leadership now, not in body armor but in patience. A month later, disaster struck again, wildfires near the Texas-New Mexico line. Her team deployed within hours. Roads burned, cell towers down, comms spotty. Brin coordinated from the command truck, mapping evacuation routes, rerouting supplies through smoke-filled corridors. At one point, a young driver froze on the radio, voice shaking. Director fired across the highway. We're trapped. She could hear the panic, the same kind she'd heard on combat channels. She took a breath. Listen to me, Corporal, she said automatically, forgetting this wasn't the army. You've got 50 meters of visibility. Turn east, follow the fence line until you see open ground. I'll guide you in. He followed every word. 10 minutes later, the truck broke through to safety. When he climbed out, covered in ash, he looked at her like she'd pulled him from another world. Ma'am, he said quietly, how'd you stay so calm? She smiled. Practice. That night after the fires settled, Brin sat alone on the tailgate of her truck, watching embers drift like stars. For the first time she felt right. Not back where she was, but exactly where she was supposed to be. Her phone buzzed, a message from her father. Proud again. Told you purpose finds you when you stop chasing it. She typed back one word, copy. When the relief team packed up to leave, Lee, the older volunteer from the flood, hugged her. You ever think of writing a book? Brin laughed. What would I call it? Lee grinned. Maybe how to lead without losing yourself. She smiled, shaking her head. I'm still figuring that out. Lee squeezed her shoulder. Then keep figuring. The world needs more people who still care. Back in Austin, the office threw her a small celebration for the success of the wildfire response. She thanked them, smiled for the photos, and slipped out early. Driving home, she detoured through a quiet park. The evening light spilled gold across the water. She sat on a bench, watching families pack up picnics, kids chasing each other through the grass. For once, she let herself simply be. No ranks, no orders, no expectations. Just a woman who had walked through humiliation, fear, and fire, and found her way back to grace. She thought about the question Lee had asked, "Do you miss it?" She did sometimes, but not for the reasons people assumed. She missed the purpose, the clarity. But now she had both, without needing a uniform to prove it. When the sun finally dipped, she whispered to herself, "Maybe that's the secret, the mission never really ends, it just changes shape." Sometimes the war ends on paper, but the battle to stay human lasts a lifetime. What if peace isn't the end of the story, but just the pause before duty finds you again? It had been almost a year since Brin Castillo left the army. Her days were filled with supply routes, warehouse budgets, and quiet evenings that felt almost too still. She learned to sleep through the silence now, though sometimes she still woke before dawn and reached for a radio that wasn't there. Then one morning the call came. A representative from the United Nations Logistics Division contacted her office. "Director Castillo, we're assembling a joint humanitarian mission in Jordan. Earthquake near the Syrian border, mass displacement, collapsed infrastructure. We need someone who can run field logistics under pressure. Your name came recommended." "Recommended by who?" she asked. There was a pause. "Colonel Evans, U.S. Army liaison to the task force." Brin smiled faintly. Evans, her old sergeant. He'd made rank, apparently, and remembered. She looked around her office. The framed certificates, the neat rows of files, the comfort she'd built. Then she looked out the window, toward the horizon. "I'm in," she said. 3 weeks later, she stepped off a C-130 onto cracked desert tarmac in northern Jordan. The air was dry and sharp. The scent of dust and diesel took her straight back to Afghanistan. Evans was waiting near the transport trucks, sunglasses on, grin unmistakable. "Ma'am, sorry, Director, welcome back to the sandbox." She laughed. "You still can't call me Brin. Old habits die hard." They shook hands, and for a moment the years fell away. Different patch, same dirt, same unspoken respect. The camp was chaos. Tents, generators, pallets of supplies, aid workers shouting over the roar of trucks. Local families lined the perimeter, waiting for food and water. Brin watched the scene with practiced eyes, organization buried under urgency. She turned to Evans. "Who's running coordination here?" He grimaced. "Technically, a committee, but they're drowning. They need a plan that works." "Then let's give them one." Within hours, she had a grid on the whiteboard, zones for distribution, color-coded routes, inventory checkpoints. Her voice cut through the noise, calm, clear, commanding without trying. Volunteers moved faster. Confusion began to fade. By sunset, the operation actually looked like an operation. Evans shook his head. "You haven't changed." She smiled. "I have, I just remember what works." That night they sat by a field heater, sipping instant coffee from metal mugs. Evans looked at her thoughtfully. "Ever think you'd end up back out here?" "No," she admitted, "but I guess purpose has good aim." He chuckled. "You know, half these kids have never seen a convoy. They're terrified every time a truck leaves the gate." She nodded. "Fear means they care. It's the careless ones that scare me." He studied her for a long moment. "You're still carrying it, aren't you? The ambush, the coke thing, all of it." She looked into her cup. "Carrying isn't the same as being haunted. It's remembering why I don't look away." He nodded slowly. "That's why I called you." 2 days later, a new complication hit. A border checkpoint 20 miles east had collapsed under aftershocks, cutting off aid convoys to the worst-hit villages. The Jordanian military was stretched thin. Someone had to coordinate a bypass route through rough terrain. Brin volunteered before anyone else could. Evans frowned. "You sure you want to lead that yourself? It's unstable country and exactly why it needs someone steady, she said. He sighed, just like old times. They rolled out before dawn. 4 trucks, 2 local guides, 1 mission. Reached the villages before the second wave of quakes. The road wound through barren hills that looked too familiar. Halfway through the pass, the lead vehicle hit soft ground and lurched sideways, tires spinning. Brin jumped out instantly, directing the others. Winch line, anchor on that rock face, keep tension steady. Her voice carried over the wind, even the locals listened. Within minutes, the truck was free. One of the guides looked at her with surprise. You lead like soldier. She smiled faintly. Once a soldier, always a little bit of one. They made it to the villages by dusk, exhausted but intact. Families rushed forward, tearful, grabbing food, water, blankets. Brin's chest tightened at the sight. Mothers clutching children, men lifting supplies with trembling hands. Different uniforms, same humanity. That night she walked outside the field tent. The stars above Jordan looked almost identical to the Afghan sky. Evans joined her quietly. You saved a lot of lives today, he said. She shook her head. We did. He studied her face. You ever think you were meant for this? Not war, not peace, just service. She considered that. Maybe. Or maybe service is just another word for not being able to watch suffering and stay still. He smiled. That's you in one sentence. The next morning, a tremor hit the valley. The ground shook, tents collapsing, dust rising in clouds. When it stopped, screams echoed through the camp. Brin sprinted toward the noise. A schoolhouse had partially caved in, trapping people inside. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a pry bar, she crawled through a gap in the rubble with 2 volunteers. Voice check, she called. A child whimpered in the dark. Hold on, we're coming. Dust filled her lungs. The beam above her groaned under weight. She felt fear before, but this was different. No enemy, no weapon, just time working against life. They found the child, a boy maybe 8, pinned beneath debris. Brin braced her shoulder under the slab. Lift on 3, 1, 2. The beam shifted. Pain shot through her arm, but she didn't stop. The boy slid free, coughing. When they crawled out, the sunlight hit them like salvation. Someone cheered. Brin just sat in the dirt, shaking, exhausted but alive. Evans rushed up. You okay? She nodded. We got him. He looked at her arm. You're bleeding. Just a scratch, she said. He smiled. Still can't tell when to stop. Never learned how, she replied. That night she sat with the rescued boy outside the medical tent. He handed her a small rock he'd been clutching. Lucky stone, he said in broken English. You keep. She smiled softly, closing his hand around it. You need it more than I do. He shook his head. You brave, you keep. She took it. The stone was warm from his hand, simple, ordinary, but heavy with meaning. She tucked it into her pocket, feeling its weight settle beside all the others she'd carried before. Days later, the mission wound down. Convoys ran on schedule. The camp stabilized. Evans found her near the trucks, staring at the horizon again. Ready to go home. She hesitated. Home feels complicated now. He nodded. It always does after you remember what you're built for. She smiled. You think this is what we were built for? He shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe this is the part we do until we figure out the rest. They stood there in the fading light, the hum of engines behind them, the desert stretching endless ahead. Back in Austin a month later, she sat in her apartment, unpacking the duffel she hadn't opened since Jordan. At the bottom, she found the small rock the boy had given her. She set it on the shelf beside her old army coin and smiled. Different war, same heart. She made coffee, stepped onto her balcony, and watched the sunrise over the city. Her phone buzzed, Another message from her father. Heard about Jordan. You did what you always do, show up where others hesitate. She typed back, guess it runs in the family. He replied with one line that stopped her cold. Service isn't a chapter, Brin. It's your language. You just learned how to speak it without shouting. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she whispered, maybe that's the truest thing you ever said. That evening, she met Leah for dinner. The older woman smiled, back from saving the world again. Brin laughed, just trying to keep it from falling apart. Leah studied her, you look lighter. Maybe I finally stopped fighting the wrong war. And which one was that? The one against myself. When she got home, she opened her old journal, the one from Afghanistan. Most pages were filled with sand-stained ink, notes of loss and lesson. She turned to a blank page and wrote slowly. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the courage to keep caring after conflict ends. She closed the book and exhaled. For the first time, she didn't feel like a soldier trying to adapt to civilian life. She felt like herself, whole, imperfect, but free. Sometimes the mission isn't to fight, or win, or even lead. Sometimes it's simply to remind the world that compassion still exists, quiet, steady, and unbroken. What if everything you went through, the humiliation, the war, the doubt, was never meant to break you, but to build the kind of strength the world quietly needs? It had been 3 years since Afghanistan, 2 since Jordan. And in all that time, Brin Castillo had learned something strange about peace. It wasn't a place you found. It was something you practiced every single day. She stood now at the edge of a podium, staring out over an auditorium filled with uniforms, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and civilians sitting shoulder to shoulder. It was a leadership symposium in D.C., and somehow her name was on the program as the keynote speaker. Captain Brin Castillo, U.S. Army, retired, Director of Global Humanitarian Logistics. The title looked surreal even to her. When the host introduced her, polite applause echoed through the hall. She walked up calmly, adjusting the mic. The same discipline she'd carried into every convoy, every storm, every impossible decision. It was all there in her steady voice. She began simply. When I was a lieutenant, she said, a superior officer poured a can of Coke over my head in front of 30 soldiers. He thought it was funny. The room went still. I didn't yell, I didn't hit back, I just stood there. She paused, and I learned something that day, that dignity doesn't need an audience. She told them the story, not the headlines, not the military gossip version, but the truth. The silence after. The quiet rage. The decision to do things the right way instead of the easy way. And then she told them what happened after the ambush, the moral crossroads, the long, lonely years of holding her ground when nobody else did. But here's the thing, she said softly. None of those moments broke me. They taught me that leadership isn't about commanding obedience. It's about carrying integrity even when it costs you everything comfortable. As she spoke, her eyes found her father in the second row, older now, but smiling with that same restrained pride that had carried her through childhood. Next to him sat Evans, in his dress blues, jaw tight like the soldier he'd always be. She continued, we live in a world that confuses loudness with strength, but the older I get, the more I believe real strength is quiet. It listens, it learns, it endures. She let the words hang there, because she knew they would land on someone, maybe some young lieutenant sitting in the crowd, wondering if silence in the face of humiliation made them weak. It didn't, it made them controlled. It made them dangerous in the right ways. When people tell you that leadership is about power, she said, remember power fades, character doesn't. The applause didn't come until she stepped back from the mic. When it did, it wasn't polite, it was real. After the talk, an Air Force cadet approached her, notebook in hand, eyes bright. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "I just wanted to say what you said about silence, it hit hard. I've seen things, and sometimes it feels like if you speak up, you lose. But if you don't, you lose yourself." Brin smiled gently. "Then choose yourself, always, because that's the one victory they can't take back." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you, ma'am." When he left, she sat down for the first time all day, letting the noise of the conference fade behind her. That evening, her father joined her on the terrace outside the hotel. The city stretched below, lights shimmering like a sea of fireflies. "You were good up there," he said. "I almost didn't do it," she admitted. Talking about the coke thing again, it felt like digging up an old wound. He nodded. Sometimes the world needs to see the scar to understand the lesson. She looked out across the Potomac. "Do you ever regret it, Dad, all those years in uniform?" He thought for a moment. "Regret? No, but I do wish I'd learned earlier what you figured out young, that strength isn't proven by how loud you shout. It's proven by how long you stand." Brin smiled faintly. "You taught me most of that." He chuckled. "Maybe, but you lived it better." A week later, she returned to Texas. Her life was quieter now. The humanitarian office, the occasional field assignment, evenings spent walking her dog through trails that smelled of cedar and sunburned grass. Sometimes she still woke before dawn, but it didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded her that discipline, once learned, never really leaves you. On her kitchen counter sat the small rock the Jordanian boy had given her. Next to it, a faded maintenance log from the day Captain Holland humiliated her, the one she'd kept, not out of bitterness, but as proof that calm could be its own weapon. She built a life out of those two things, mercy and memory. One afternoon, her phone rang. It was Lee, the older volunteer she'd met during the floods. "Got a young woman here who wants to join the relief corps," Lee said. "She's tough, smart, maybe too hard on herself. I think she could use someone to talk to." Brin didn't hesitate. "Send her my way." A week later, a nervous 20-something showed up at her office. Ex-military, logistics background, sharp eyes hiding exhaustion. Brin gestured to a chair. "You remind me of someone I used to be." The young woman laughed awkwardly. "That good or bad?" "Depends how you handle what comes next." They talked for hours, about pressure, isolation, and the strange way responsibility could both crush and define you. When the girl left, she said softly, "Ma'am, you make it sound possible, to lead without losing who you are." Brin smiled. "It is possible, just harder than anyone admits." That night, as she locked up her office, she paused by the door. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. She thought about the soldiers who'd served under her, the ones who never came home, the ones who still carried invisible wounds. She thought about Holland, and realized she hadn't thought of him in months. He was just a footnote now. The lesson had outlived the insult. And maybe that was the real victory. Months later, she visited Fort Drum for a guest lecture. As she walked across the parade field, the wind caught the flag overhead, crisp, clean, bright against the sky. For a moment she closed her eyes. She could almost hear the hum of the motor pool, the laughter, the silence. Only this time it didn't sting, it steadied her. A young lieutenant passing by saluted sharply. "Ma'am," he said, "you're the Castillo, right, the one from that story?" She smiled faintly. "Depends which version you heard." "The one about the officer who kept her cool when someone tried to humiliate her." He hesitated. "That story's kind of legend now." Brin chuckled softly. "Then I hope they got the ending right." He grinned. "What's the real ending, ma'am?" She looked out across the field, sunlight glinting off the rows of vehicles just like before. "The real ending," she said, "is that it wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, and how you carry yourself when no one else remembers who you are." He nodded slowly. I'll remember that. She smiled. Good, then maybe the story did its job. That evening, she drove to the overlook outside base. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, the same colors she'd watched so many years ago after her first convoy came home. She sat on the hood of her car, wind tugging at her hair, and whispered quietly, "You were right, Dad. Strength isn't about shouting, it's about standing." She thought about every choice, every scar, every silent victory. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was carrying them. She felt like they were carrying her. Sometimes the smallest acts, the choice to stay calm, to stay kind, to stay true, ripple farther than any battle ever fought. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And that's how her story ended. Not with medals, not with speeches, but with legacy, quiet, invisible, and lasting. A soldier once humiliated in front of 30 men became a leader, whose silence changed the meaning of respect. And somewhere in a motor pool far from home, another young officer stood a little taller, because someone, once upon a time, refused to bow. The war gave her courage. The humiliation gave her patience. But dignity that she built herself. And in the end, that was enough.